pleasure to have the opportunity to address you again, but no, it's not the grand final. In terms of what I'm going to say is I'll spend a couple of minutes in terms of our general overview towards the budget, and then talk a little bit about where we're seeing the economy. As a general reaction, I think the way you need to think about the government's budget is that it's really making room for some large commitments that it's already set up. So if you look down the track in terms of what we're going to be coming up against, you've got national disability, you've got the Gonski education reforms, and you've got paid parental leave, all of which are big programs that are about to kick in. So really what they've done is they've come in, they've restructured the budget, reprioritised it, and they've tried to strengthen it. I should say up front, from an economist's point of view, where you started from was not a fiscal disaster or a crisis in any way. It was basically a situation where you were running into a deficit, and given these sort of large outlays coming down the track, you weren't likely to be getting back to surplus anytime soon. The way I think the government has reacted is just about everybody knows what was in the budget or knew what was in the budget. We kept looking for new things. They weren't there. Essentially, their aim has been to essentially start on the budget repair and getting things better straight away. Share the pain is sort of the theory, so everybody gets it. And some of the policy adjustments are quite large. So you're talking in terms of structural changes in the budget of around 15 billion over the next 3 to 4 years. So they're quite large adjustments. To me, there are some risks. Basically, the domestic economy is still quite fragile. So if you take out exports and imports, the domestic part of the economy is growing at around 1%. That's our view. It's also the Federal Treasury's view. So whilst you might look at things like the petrol excise and the high income earners tax rebate, tax increase, sorry. I wish it was a rebate, but anyway. They by themselves are not enough to cause any real serious grief given the size of the economy. But them, together with a lot of changes in terms of government entitlements, could cause some issues about confidence. And there I think we just have to sit and wait and see what happens. In terms of some of the other comments I heard that this was more aggressive than Peter Costello and John Howard's in the mid-90s. That's just not factually true, and I can show you that later on. But it was quite an aggressive adjustment. If you compare the current budget with what happened in the mid-90s, there was no Gonski, there was none of these big reforms coming in terms of outlays, it was just pure cuts. Most of the repairs of the budget is done through revenues, and basically what really happens is it starts to kick in 2015 and 16 when you essentially get some of these effects in terms of the tax and the petrol, the fading out of foreign aid all kick in. There's still some structural issues in the budget in the sense of you can't do everything, but one of the ones, for example, that you've got is you've still got a very low corporate tax collection, and unless you're a large guy, you did get a tax cut last night. There are still issues associated with most of the economy in terms of the strength are in the services sector, and there's essentially no taxes on that. So the goods and services tax are basically goods tax. And then there's also the issue of this large gap now that's continued to emerge between the top marginal tax rate and the corporate rate. When I was in Treasury, everyone used to say you could never have them different. That's now changed and it's got worse. Infrastructure spending will help. It's around 11.6 billion, but it will be a medium-term thing. I know the Treasurer was talking about shovel-ready, etc. They're not. It'll still take time. So it will help the medium term. It's not necessarily going to help in the short term. If I'm looking at the forecast, I think, if anything, they're probably conservative. And so I think Treasury is trying to make sure they don't make the same mistake again. And I think the other big issue hanging over this budget is how much we'll get through the Senate. Just to give you a quick overview of what they've done, I'm sure you've seen lots of these sort of things. They've tightened up the eligibility essentially for welfare. Things like the family tax benefit threshold has come down. It's harder to get unemployment, and they've eventually, you're going to have to essentially work to 70, although not to 2035. So it's not keying in anytime soon. The cuts to the public sector, they sort of had come in with the expectation of 12,000 cuts of jobs. That's now up at 16,500. There's a merger or abolition of 70 government agencies, and they're talking about privatisation. They have a whole range of them. No actual numbers, but things like the Australian Mint are up. The deficit levy, 2% increase, raises about $3 billion over 3 years. Put that in context, the Australian economy each year is 1.5 trillion. So it's a big economy. So that's why it doesn't have a huge income. The company tax reductions, provided not large. There has, however, on the other side, been reductions in government assistance programs worth to industry about $850 million. The petrol excise indexation starts up again. One of the angles that was slightly new to me was the idea of hypothecation, where you basically take that money and you say, I'm only going to use that essentially to build new roads. So you sort of put the money away for that. So heard everyone knew about the petrol increase, but not about it being just set aside for just one purpose. Same sort of thing happened for the doctors and hospital co-payment. Roughly, you get $7 every time you go and see the GP. $2 goes to essentially the doctor. The other $5 goes into a hypothecated fund, which is essentially a medical research fund. And the aim is within 6 years to have that up to $20 billion. And that will basically support medical research. They have university fee liberalisation, which basically means that if you're trying to go to university for a course that's going to get you a job, you're probably going to pay more money for it. The Gonski reforms, essentially what's happened there is they've committed for the first 3 years or 4 years, which they said they would, but once you get to 2018, there's no more increases in the funding. Rather, what happens, you just index from there on. Infrastructure spending, as I said, is around $11.6 billion. We think that will add, using the multipliers that we normally run, of around 35,000 new jobs over a 3 to 4 year period. So it does actually help a lot, but it might not help until you actually get moving on. The other big issue was that most of the sort of adjustments were on the transfer side. In other words, people are not getting as much from the government rather than cutting back big time on the actual spending the government's making. And this is basically looking at essentially outlays, or what we call revenue and expenses. And you can see the blue line there, the big fall in the revenue that the government's got during the global financial crisis. And the expectation as you go forward that that's going to pick up. So, you know, in a banking terminology, we talk about jaws, in other words, your costs versus your incomes. And it's really being driven by the blue line, i.e. the revenue line. The red line is basically your expenses. There's a bit of a slowdown from last year, but last year's kick up was basically the government giving $9 billion to the Reserve Bank. And they don't give $9 billion to the Reserve Bank every year. So basically what you've got is a trend down a little bit, but not a lot as you go forward. This is just a graph in red that shows you what they've actually done in policy. And blue is what we call parameters, which is really the economy. So as you see, particularly in the out years, you get a large adjustment as the full impact of some of these taxes, excises, etc. kick in. So it is actually, when you look underneath it, quite a restrictive budget. It's just that it's being offset by these big outlays that we've previously signed up for. In terms of, this is a sort of an Economist graph. What it is, it tries to say, okay, what is the budget actually doing to the economy? And so if you look back through time, during the global financial crisis, you can see the budget was adding about 3% to GDP at the time. Recently, or last year, it was sort of basically taking a little bit, or was actually giving a little bit. And if you look forward in the forecasting period, essentially you're taking about 0.5% off GDP each year because of the budget. That's really what the OECD methodology of what we call a structural impulse is showing you. So that's really the bottom line of what the budget's doing to the economy.